everyone, I'm Sabina Ciofu, I'm Romanian, I live in Brussels and I work at the crossroads of tech, regulation and trade, which may sound a bit complicated, but I basically work for the British Trade Association for technology companies, and I do mainly EU affairs and international trade policy. So that gets me to work pretty much everyone on the planet on how to get tech regulation and trade policy right. It's hard to talk about a typical day because in this line of work you do a lot of influencing of policy, talking to policymakers, figuring out what a policy should be. So there is a lot of writing sometimes where you spend a few days doing nothing but that. There will be a lot of meetings on Zoom these days, but also physical. There'll be a lot of travel to kind of speak to policymakers wherever they are. And there will be a lot of trying to work out with industry what the technology issues may be and how the policy actually ends up being implemented in a company by engineers who sometimes have nothing to do with policy, most of the times have nothing to do with policy. So that it's that whole conversation about what the law says and what technology can do. So I think in this line of work it's really important to be adaptable, to be flexible, and to put a lot of value on network and the people you meet and the connections you make. I also think public speaking helps, kind of learning those skills and getting to a point where you can speak publicly with confidence and own a subject matter is really important. I have a very non-traditional path, if you want to call it that way. I was born a year before the revolutions that brought down the Berlin Wall and with it the communist regimes in Eastern Europe. And I went to university in 2007 in the UK, which was the year my country joined the European Union and the only time I could have afforded to actually study in the UK. So in a way, although not a life of richness or privilege, it was a life of huge opportunity. And that's what motivates a lot what I'm doing today, of being part of policy and politics and working on shaping the world of tomorrow to a certain extent, because I've been given so much by being part of the European Union and the club of countries that have provided for a lot of my education and a lot of the professional opportunities that I have had since my education. I have actually studied classics in uni. I have done my undergraduate degree in Cambridge in Latin and ancient Greek for 3 years of my life. You would think that's disconnected, but I have come to find out that that's not the case. Actually, a lot of the philosophy and a lot of the political thinking of the world starts somewhere around there. So it's been a great 3 years of my life, and I think more than what I've learned, it's the skills and it's the community that I've studied with, that and the clubs that I've been part of that allowed me to define what I would like to do next. At that time, I thought the way you change the world is politics. I still do to a certain extent now. And after university, straight on went to Brussels. I thought the politics that I thought could change the world is the European politics. Still do to a certain extent. And I have done my master's while working in Brussels in war studies, which was another area that suddenly became very interesting to me through my work at the time. And then ended up working in technology and trade, so not a lot of link between the various fields of study and various fields of work. But I think what my lesson was throughout all this was, you should always study what you feel you're interested in and work in what you feel you're interested in, and sometimes they're not necessarily the same, and that's fine. I mean, it's a lot to do with my upbringing. The fact that I was born and raised in a former communist country, in a small town in the northeast of Romania, to a family that had known zero opportunity or openness or anything about the world for decades. And one of the things that has really shaped my kind of engagement with policy and politics has been my grandfather's commitment to democracy in a time where, you know, that's not necessarily a thing that's welcome. He was anti-communist and he was arrested a number of times, spent a lot of time in prison for barely making jokes about the regime or, saying things that you're not supposed to say. And I remember, like, when Stalin died, he basically said, "I'm going to dress my broom in black." And for that, he went for 10 months to prison. And he passed away 2 weeks before the revolution. He never got to see the change. So my kind of involvement ever since with kind of the democratic process and civic engagement and the politics of my country and the European Union have a lot to do with, you know, how much he would have given just to be able to see democracy coming back. I think a big part of being young and in a career in policy is that you don't really understand the value of the network. And I've come to understand over the years that it's a lot more important who you know than what you know. That's not to say they exclude each other, but building your network early on is really important. And that ability to reach out to people who are a lot more senior than you, which can seem intimidating when you're 23 and just doing your first internship in Brussels. But that is what's going to change your path ahead. And I say that because a lot of people find it weird, awkward, intimidating to just write to this very senior person that you've never spoken to, you've never met. But actually, what's the worst that can happen? You know, they most likely don't reply, which is probably not that tragic, but the best that can happen is that you build those amazing connections, you have those amazing conversations with people who've been 20, 30 years in a career, and get to shape your own path by actually knowing these people and having those valuable conversations. So I would have liked to have done a lot more of that when I was 22 as opposed to when I already had 10 years of experience. Yeah, so the best piece of advice I've been given on my first internship, which was with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Romania, and a very good friend of mine who was a diplomat and advised me in those early steps into the diplomatic world, was just make sure that you close the door as nicely as you opened them. And I think that's so important because, you know, throughout your career, you'll work with people you don't like. You'll work with bosses you don't like. You'll come across people that maybe don't share your values or your views of the world. And having the ability to kind of respond with kindness and with, you know, grace to whatever it is that you hear or encounter is probably the best thing I've learned and would love to pass on. I think definitely the Brussels effect. When you work in Brussels in policy, you often hear, the European Union is famous for over-regulating everything. Before things have even happened, Europe is thinking about how to regulate it. And I think that's fair to a certain extent. But the Brussels effect actually shows what Europe does as a global superpower of regulation. And I think especially for the field that I'm working in, which is technology, and everything to do with consumer protection, with privacy, with technology regulation, everything we are seeing now that's being developed by the European Union in terms of technology regulation, you see that effect that Brussels has on the rest of the world and how companies and how industry and how people think about the challenges and the issues at hand. So I think definitely that's a good introduction to the world of policy in Brussels.